Ready? Let's begin. The Plague of Darkness and the Volcanic Winter. In the summer of 1628 BC, something went wrong with the sun. Sumerian lament texts, composed centuries earlier and copied obsessively by scribes who clearly believed the warning mattered, describe a catastrophe in language that stops you cold. The sun did not rise for 7 days, and the wind that came brought neither rain nor coolness, only darkness and dust. Modern volcanologists have studied that phrase. They believe they know exactly what caused it. Before that summer, the Bronze Age world was humming. Mesopotamian city-states traded grain and copper across routes stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean. Egyptian pharaohs were building monuments. The Shang dynasty in China was in its early, confident centuries. The climate was stable enough that civilizations had been stacking complexity for 1,000 years, assuming the sky would keep cooperating. It had, until it didn't. The Thera eruption on the island of Santorini is now confirmed via ice core, dating to have injected enough sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere to drop global temperatures by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. That sounds modest. It was catastrophic. The GIS-2 Greenland ice core shows a sulfur spike at exactly this period. Irish oak tree rings and Californian bristlecone pines from 1628 BC are the narrowest in 4,600 years of continuous record. Simultaneous crop failures appear in Egyptian papyri, Chinese oracle bones, and Mesopotamian accounting tablets, each culture recording the same impossible harvest in different scripts. The narrowest rings don't appear once. They appear in a cluster across roughly a decade, suggesting not a single eruption, but a sequence of linked volcanic events, compressing the agricultural calendar of the entire ancient world into something that could no longer sustain the populations built to depend on it. The Sumerians may have recorded several linked disasters as a single continuous plague, because, from ground level, that is exactly what it felt like. Scientists at the European Geosciences Union have modeled a repeat event, a Yellowstone scale eruption, which the geological record suggests occurs roughly every 600,000 years, is statistically overdue. If the sun disappeared for 7 days in 1628 BC and left a chemical signature still readable in Greenland ice today, what happens the next time a supervolcano decides the climate needs resetting? The plague of falling water. A Sumerian king list, one of the oldest administrative documents in human history, does something that no modern historian has ever fully explained. Between two dynasties, as casually as a scribe might note a change of season, it inserts a global flood. What comes before the flood is listed in reigns of tens of thousands of years. What comes after looks like our world. The line reads, "The flood swept over. Kingship descended from heaven again." That again is the word that should unsettle you. The Eridu Genesis, composed around 2300 BC, but drawing on oral traditions centuries older, frames the flood not as the main event, but as the final act in a sequence. First came drought, then disease, then famine, then the deluge. The Atrahasis epic, the most complete Mesopotamian flood narrative, is explicit. The gods sent plagues in waves, not all at once, because they wanted humanity reduced gradually. Whether or not you read that as theology, the epidemiological sequence it describes is exactly correct. Waterborne disease follows flooding. Famine follows crop destruction. Societal collapse follows famine. The Black Sea catastrophe hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University in 1997, suggests a catastrophic saltwater influx around 5600 BC inundated roughly 155,000 square kilometers of inhabited land within months. Separately, sediment cores from the Persian Gulf show a massive freshwater pulse around 7000 BC, consistent with post-glacial sea level rise of 120 meters over several millennia. Irving Finkel of the British Museum translated a 4,000-year-old clay tablet in 2014, describing the arc as a circular coracle 65 meters in diameter, an engineering specification rather than a metaphor, optimized for surviving sudden inundation rather than open ocean sailing. The plague texts embedded within the flood narratives describe swollen bodies, eruptions of the skin, and mass death in the days before the waters rose. The symptomology is consistent with waterborne cholera or typhoid, diseases that spike in exactly the conditions created by flooding and displacement. The Sumerians recorded the disease and the disaster as a single event because, in practice, they were inseparable. The Sumerians weren't afraid of the water. They were afraid of what the water brought with it, and they were right to be. The plague of skin. In the city of Nippur, sometime around 1350 BC, a physician pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and described a patient in language that a modern infectious disease specialist would recognize without a translator. White pustules cover the body like stars in the night sky. The face, the hands, the feet. Death follows within 7 days. The document is the Sakiku, the Diagnostic Handbook. It is the oldest surviving medical diagnostic text in the world, and it is describing smallpox. The Sakiku was compiled across 40 clay tablets by the scholar-physician Esagil Kin Apli, working under the Babylonian king Adad Apla Idina around 1069 BC. But the clinical observations it records draw on centuries of accumulated Mesopotamian medical practice. The handbook distinguishes between diseases by symptom cluster, with a precision that implies generations of careful observation. The pustule disease it describes is not grouped with fever diseases or wound diseases. It has its own category, its own demon, its own treatment protocol, and its own prognosis, which is uniformly fatal. DNA analysis of Egyptian mummies, published in the journal Science in 2020, confirmed ancient smallpox strains circulating as early as 1700 BC. Simultaneously, the Hittite plague prayers of King Mursili II, composed around 1322 BC, describe a disease that arrived among his people, carried by Egyptian prisoners of war. The disease killed the Hittite king, Supi-Lulumathuri-Or, and his successor within years of their accession, destabilizing the most powerful empire in the ancient Near East at the precise moment when it might have permanently eclipsed Egypt. One epidemic, carried by one group of prisoners, may have redirected the entire political history of the Bronze Age. What makes Mursili's prayers extraordinary is not that he begged the gods to stop the plague. It is that he conducted what can only be described as a theological forensic investigation, demanding to know where the disease originated, who first carried it, and why the gods allowed it to cross the border. He was looking for patient zero. He was doing epidemiology in cuneiform, 4,000 years before the word existed. Smallpox's closest relatives, monkeypox and camelpox, are still circulating in animal reservoirs across Central Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. A 2022 WHO emergency briefing flagged engineered orthopox virus variants as a Tier 1 bioterrorism risk, potentially more lethal than historical smallpox strains. If a disease indistinguishable from smallpox was already reshaping empires in 1322 BC, and its animal relatives are still out there today, what exactly are we waiting for? The plague of locusts. The lamentation over the destruction of Nippur was written at least 400 years before the Book of Exodus recorded its famous plague of locusts. The Sumerian text doesn't dress it up. The fields were consumed from horizon to horizon, it reads. No seed remained in the earth. The granaries were opened and found empty. That sentence wasn't written by a priest composing mythology. It was written by an administrator recording a catastrophe, and modern entomologists reading it 4,000 years later understand exactly what he was describing. A single swarm of desert locusts, Schistocerca gregaria, can cover 460 square kilometers and consume the food supply of 35,000 people in a single day. That figure comes from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, not from ancient texts. The 2019 and 2020 East African locust crisis, the worst outbreak in 70 years, destroyed crops across 23 countries and threatened the food security of 42 million people. The mechanism has not changed. The scale has not diminished. Only the civilizations watching it happen have been replaced. What the Sumerian administrative records reveal is something beyond the devastation itself. Cuneiform accounting tablets from the city of Ur show grain reserves being drawn down, not gradually, over years of incremental shortage, but catastrophically, over 2 to 3 months, in a pattern that matches locust devastation rather than drought or military disruption. The Nippur texts also note that outbreaks followed unusually wet seasons after extended drought, the exact cyclical trigger identified today by the Desert Locust Information Service, whose models rely on the same climate pattern the Sumerians observed. Emergency grain redistribution protocols described in tablets from 1800 BC suggest the civilization had experienced this before and built institutional memory around surviving it. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian grain stores shows traces of fungal contamination consistent with aflatoxin-producing molds, which follow locust damage by weeks, compounding famine with toxicity. The locusts ate the crop. The mold poisoned what was left. The people starved on grain that looked intact. They called it a punishment from the gods because they had no other word for a biological event that could erase a civilization's food supply in 72 hours. We have the word now. We just don't use it loudly enough. The Plague of Cattle. The lament for the destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BC after the Akkadian Empire's collapse, contains a passage that reads differently once you understand what you're looking at. The cattle lowed, but there was none to hear them. The sheepfold was silent. The poet wasn't being metaphorical about loneliness. He was recording the first domino. Every major Mesopotamian collapse on record was preceded by agricultural failure. Every agricultural failure on record was preceded by the death of animals. Before the Bronze Age world could collapse, it had to lose its livestock. The domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats of Mesopotamia were not just food sources. They were the agricultural engine, the transportation network, the textile industry, and the protein supply of the entire civilization simultaneously. A livestock pandemic didn't just reduce the food supply. It removed the biological infrastructure that made food production possible. Zooarchaeological evidence from Tel Abu Huraira in Syria shows catastrophic livestock mortality events coinciding precisely with known drought periods and societal collapse markers. The animals died first. The people followed. Sumerian veterinary texts describe a disease that makes the cattle's eyes run and their bodies grow thin. A clinical description consistent with rinderpest or foot and mouth disease. Rinderpest, the cattle plague, is the only animal disease ever officially eradicated, declared eliminated by the United Nations in 2011. But its cousin, Peste des petits ruminants, still circulates across Africa and Asia, affecting roughly 80% of the world's small ruminants. In 1890, a rinderpest outbreak swept sub-Saharan Africa and killed 90% of the cattle population. The resulting famine killed approximately 1/3 of the human population of Ethiopia within 2 years. One disease, one species, 1/3 of a nation's people. Brandon Drake, writing in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012, linked the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 BC, which simultaneously destroyed the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, and destabilized Egypt, to a 300-year drought. A drought that's severe doesn't just dry the rivers. It kills the grass. The grass dies, the cattle die, the civilization follows. If a cattle plague in 1890 could kill 1/3 of Ethiopia's human population within 2 years, what does a livestock pandemic look like in a world of 8 billion people and industrial-scale factory farming, where a single facility houses hundreds of thousands of animals in permanent close contact? The plague of waters turned bitter. A hymn to the Sumerian water god, Enki, composed around 2000 BC, contains a phrase that scholars have puzzled over for generations. The great waters turned red and the fish lay on their bellies. For a long time, that was filed under religious poetry, an image of divine punishment too abstract to analyze. Then, limnologists read it. They had a name for it immediately: a harmful algal bloom. The Sumerians had watched their rivers turn color and kill everything that drank from them, and they encoded the event in a hymn to the god of water, because that was the only framework large enough to contain what they had witnessed. Harmful algal blooms produce cyanotoxins and saxitoxins that contaminate drinking water, kill fish, sicken livestock, and poison human populations. They are not rare events. They are recurring ecological crises whose frequency is accelerating. NOAA data shows a significant increase in harmful algal bloom events in United States coastal and freshwater systems between 2000 and 2020, and the Lake Erie bloom of 2014 left 400,000 residents of Toledo, Ohio, without safe drinking water for 3 days. A modern American city. 3 days without water because of algae. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the actual waterways referenced in Sumerian texts, have lost approximately 40% of their flow since 1970, according to the World Resources Institute. Turkey's upstream dam construction, combined with climate-driven snowpack loss in the Anatolian highlands, is concentrating nutrients and pollutants in what remains of the river system, dramatically increasing bloom risk. The rivers the Sumerians worshipped are now under greater environmental stress than at any point since the Bronze Age. A 2023 study in Nature Climate Change identified harmful algal blooms as a probable contributing factor to at least 3 Bronze Age site abandonments in the eastern Mediterranean, which suggests the Sumerians weren't recording an isolated divine intervention. They were recording a recurring feature of their environment. The Tigris and Euphrates may effectively cease to flow seasonally within 50 years. The civilization that gave us writing, mathematics, and the first legal codes was built on those rivers. When the water turned red, they wrote it down. They built temples to the god of water. They prayed for the rivers to return. Some of those prayers are still on clay tablets in museums right now, waiting to be relevant again. The Sumerians watched the water of life turn red and wrote it down. We have satellites, sensors, and chemistry labs telling us the same story. The difference is they stopped building cities on the banks. The plague of darkness in the mind. The Curse of a God is one of the oldest narrative texts in existence, composed around 2100 BC to explain something the Sumerians found more incomprehensible than military defeat or famine. The Akkadian capital, the greatest city of its age, had simply stopped. Not burned, not conquered, not buried by flood. Stopped. The text reaches for language to describe it and lands on something that sounds less like history and more like a clinical observation. Its people's face became strange to each other. That phrase is 4,000 years old. Psychiatrists reading it today recognize what it describes. The 4.2 kiloyear event is a global climate catastrophe, now confirmed across sediment cores, cave formations, and ice cores from Greenland to Antarctica. Around 2200 BC, a rapid and severe drought collapsed the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, brought down the Egyptian Old Kingdom, triggered the abandonment of Indus Valley settlements, and destabilized early Bronze Age communities across the Levant, seemingly simultaneously. Harvey Weiss of Yale University excavated Tel Leilan in Syria in 1993 and found something that changed how archaeologists thought about collapse. A 300-year occupation gap. An entire city, simply abandoned and never reoccupied for 10 generations. The Sumerian texts describing this collapse use the same vocabulary reserved for physical plagues. Infection, spreading, no cure. This is significant, not because the Sumerians were confused about the difference between drought and disease, but because they understood that what happened to a civilization after extreme climate shock was itself a form of contagion. Social trust collapsed. Institutional function dissolved. Fertility declined. The behaviors associated with collective trauma spread through a population the way a pathogen spreads, person to person, community to community, until the will to rebuild was gone. Modern research on disaster populations confirms the pattern. Studies of communities after Hurricane Katrina and the Syrian displacement crisis show acute collective trauma producing social withdrawal, fertility decline, and institutional breakdown in sequences that mirror the Sumerian record with uncomfortable precision. Bessel van der Kolk's research on collective trauma demonstrates that psychological collapse in communities follows a predictable cascade, not a random unraveling. The Tel Leilan abandonment lasted 300 years, 10 generations of people who never went back. Whatever broke in 2200 BC wasn't healed by outliving it. It was healed only by forgetting it completely. If a 3-century drought could make an entire civilization collectively decide the world was no longer worth inhabiting, what does that say about the psychological resilience of a civilization that has never faced anything harder than a difficult economic cycle? The Plague of Seven. The Enuma Anu Enlil is not a prophecy. That distinction matters. This Mesopotamian astrological compendium, 70 clay tablets compiled around 1000 BC, but drawing on observations dating back to at least 1800 BC, correlate specific celestial configurations with earthly events based on recorded history, not divine revelation. Among its entries, recurring with quiet insistence across multiple tablets, is a formula that should interest anyone who has lived through the last 5 years. Every 7th year, pestilence, not as a curse, as a pattern they had watched long enough to expect. The 7-year plague cycle appears independently in Sumerian records, Akkadian administrative texts, the Hebrew sabbatical year system, and later in Greek and Roman agricultural writing. The convergence across unconnected traditions suggests not shared mythology, but shared observation of a real recurrence interval. Epidemiologist Boris Schmid, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015, demonstrated that bubonic plague recurrence in medieval Europe followed a cycle of roughly 7 to 8 years, corresponding to climate oscillations affecting rodent reservoir populations. The Sumerians encoded the same interval in celestial terms because the stars were their calendar and their data archived simultaneously. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, has been recovered from Eurasian burial sites dating to 3000 BC, placing it in active circulation during the Sumerian period. The Mesopotamian texts describe the plague demon Namtar as one who returns when the stars of his rising return, which reads as mythology until you understand that Namtar's cycle, mapped against the Enuma Anu Enlil's celestial timetable, corresponds to intervals that match vector-borne disease cycling through animal reservoir populations. They weren't worshiping a demon. They were tracking a pathogen by its reappearance schedule. The 132 new RNA virus species identified in Tibetan permafrost ice cores in a 2022 study in Nature represent one data point in a growing body of evidence that the microbial world carries far more variety than our immune systems have ever encountered. Event 201, the pandemic preparedness exercise conducted in October 2019, used a coronavirus scenario and projected 65 million deaths. Actual confirmed COVID-19 deaths exceeded 7 million, with excess mortality estimates ranging between 15 and 20 million. They carved the outbreak schedule into stone because they knew it was coming back. We put it in a PowerPoint presentation in October 2019, acknowledged it was coming, and then did nothing. The Sumerians, it turns out, were better prepared. The plague of the underworld. The ancient Sumerians had a god specifically assigned to epidemic disease. His name was Nergal. He ruled the underworld, and the texts that describe his domain and his methods read less like theology and more like a threat assessment. Nergal's portfolio in Sumerian cosmology encompassed plague, war, drought, and the killing heat of the summer sun. a cluster of forces that modern epidemiologists would recognize as the primary drivers of zoonotic disease spillover: heat stress, conflict, environmental disruption, and death. He wasn't a metaphor for evil. He was a personification of a system. The Descent of Inanna, composed around 2100 BC, describes the Sumerian underworld as a place where disease is stored behind 7 locked gates, organized, categorized, and held in containment. The afflictions of Kur were sealed behind 7 gates, the text reads. Each gate opened represents not a spiritual descent, but, in the most literal reading available, the release of something that had been safely locked away. The Makal incantation series, used in Mesopotamian exorcism rituals, describes plague arrows shot invisibly into victims, a metaphor that maps precisely onto airborne or vector-borne transmission. The Sumerian medical texts distinguish at least 6 distinct categories of plague attributed to Nergal, each with different symptom profiles, suggesting observational differentiation of disease types 4,000 years before germ theory. In 2014, scientists revived Pithovirus sibericum, a 30,000-year-old giant virus recovered from Siberian permafrost. It was still infectious. In the summer of 2016, thawing permafrost in the Yamal Peninsula of Siberia exposed the frozen carcass of a reindeer that had died of anthrax approximately 75 years earlier. The spores were still viable. A 12-year-old boy died. 20 people were hospitalized. Roughly 2,300 reindeer died within weeks. A 2022 study in the journal Nature identified 132 previously unknown RNA virus species in Tibetan glacier ice cores, organisms with no known modern descendants and no corresponding human immune memory. The number 7 recurs in Sumerian plague literature with a consistency that exceeds coincidence. 7 gates of the underworld, 7 demons of Nergal, 7-year plague cycles. Scholars have noted that 7 appears to represent the observed maximum number of distinct concurrent epidemics experienced during Mesopotamian collapse events. They weren't counting sacred days. They were counting simultaneous outbreaks and encoding the number in the most memorable format available. If the Sumerians built an entire theological system around the concept of ancient pathogens locked underground and released under specific climate conditions, and if scientists in 2024 are describing permafrost thaw in precisely those terms, at what point do we stop calling it mythology? The 11th plague, the one with no name. Somewhere in the 3rd tablet of the Atrahasis epic, in a section most translations move through quickly, there is a description of a plague so different from the others that the scribes didn't assign it a name. They didn't give it a demon. They didn't prescribe a ritual to repel it. They described it only by what it did. The Sumerian phrase used is lipet libi, which translates literally as affliction of the heart. Scholars working with Stephanie Daly's 1989 Cambridge edition of Myths from Mesopotamia have noted that this phrase appears in this context, and as far as the surviving corpus reveals, almost nowhere else. Whatever this plague was, the Sumerians recognized it as categorically different from everything that came before it. It didn't burn the body, or rot the skin, or empty the granaries. It made the survivors wish they hadn't survived. Every other plague in Sumerian literature has a mechanism, a demon responsible, a vector, a season, a celestial trigger. This one arrives after the others, not instead of them. The text describes communities intact in terms of physical survival, but no longer functioning. People present, but not building. Alive, but not continuing. The scribes reach for the language of disease because nothing else fits what they are observing, a contagion of the will. Joseph Tainter, in his foundational 1988 study, The Collapse of Complex Societies, identified the decisive variable in civilizational collapse not as resource depletion or military defeat, but as the point at which a society loses the collective belief that tomorrow is worth investing in. Complexity requires maintenance. Maintenance requires motivation. When the motivation dissolves, the complexity collapses faster than any army could bring it down. The Sumerians, without Tainter's vocabulary, were describing the same mechanism. A 2021 study published in Lancet Planetary Health, led by Caroline Hickman and colleagues, surveyed 10,000 young people across 10 countries and found that 59% felt humanity was doomed, and 45% said their feelings about climate change negatively affected their daily functioning. These are not fringe responses. They are a measurable signal of collective psychological withdrawal from a future that feels foreclosed. The prayer at the end of the Atrahasis passage on Lipit Libi is unlike any other Sumerian plague prayer. It doesn't ask for the disease to stop. It asks for the ability to feel the need to survive. The scribes who carved it understood something that took us 4,000 years to rediscover. The most lethal plague is not the one that kills the body. It is the one that makes the body forget why it wanted to live. The Sumerians listed 10 plagues and then described one more, not the most violent, not the most physically lethal, the one that arrives last, after the floods, the fires, the poisoned rivers, the dying cattle, and the darkened sun. It has no name because they had no word for a sickness of civilization itself. We are still looking for that word, and we are watching the conditions spread. 10 plagues. 10 separate warnings pressed into clay by people who had already lived through them and wanted to make sure someone, somewhere, would understand what was coming. What's striking, looking at the complete record, is how precisely the Sumerian sequence maps onto the threat landscape scientists are actively monitoring today. Volcanic winters, flood-driven disease, cascades, hemorrhagic skin plagues still circulating in animal populations, locust swarms expanding into new territories, livestock pandemics threatening industrial food systems, toxic water events accelerating with rising temperatures, civilizational psychological collapse following climate shock, predictable pandemic cycles we keep failing to prepare for, ancient pathogens thawing from permafrost with no corresponding human immunity. And beneath all of it, the unnamed condition, the affliction of the heart, the loss of collective will that the Sumerians recognized as the final, decisive plague. They survived it. They encoded it. They left the record in the most durable medium available. Whether we read it in time is the only question that remains open. What connects everyone watching this video is the same instinct that drove Sumerian scribes to press a stylus into wet clay. The refusal to look away. The insistence that the pattern matters. That it can be read. That it should be. If this series belongs in your regular rotation, subscribe and make it official. The archive is here. The record is still being written.